VOA Africa.
Hello, I'm Esther Gidu-Ewart. It's Monday, September 19th. This is Africa 54.
Members of the royal family gather at Westminster Abbey for the state funeral of Queen Elizabeth II, as Britain and the world honor a monarch who reigned for 70 years. The United Nations General Assembly in New York takes place in the shadow of the Queen's funeral and the war in Ukraine. We'll have a live report from the UN. And the President of Botswana tells VOA the decision to impose a state of emergency helped the southern African country to better manage the COVID-19 pandemic. All this and much more on today's Africa 54.
We begin in Britain with the funeral of Queen Elizabeth II. Massive crowds gathered along the streets of London Monday to honor a monarch whose 70-year reign defined an age. Britain and the world said their final goodbyes to the Queen at a state funeral that drew presidents and kings, princes and prime ministers. Correspondent Ian Wafula has more.
Today, Queen Elizabeth II was laid to rest after a series of meticulously planned events that stretched for about 10 days, traditionally held in honor of a monarch. Remember, the last time we saw this was back in 1952 during the passing of her father, King George. A special service was held here at the Westminster Abbey, which was a special place for her during her reign because it is here where she was first coronated. It is also here where a special service in honor of her late father was held, and it is also here where she got married to the late Prince Philip. From the early hours of the morning, thousands of people turned out here from all generations and all walks of life to pay respect to the only queen most of them have known. Remember, she was on the throne for about 70 years.
What stood out for me is the outpouring of grief by so many people. I didn't expect so many people to come like this, and bringing so many flowers yesterday. We couldn't get into the park because there were so many people.
She just to me is an amazing person. It's not only the Queen of UK, not only the Queen of the Commonwealth. I think he's the Queen of the mother, the great mother of the whole world. So she's just an amazing person.
While the United Kingdom was in mourning, it was sort of a different world for the people on the African continent and the Caribbean, because some of the atrocities committed during the colonial period could not be ignored, and many questioned what the Queen's position was in regards to some of these issues.
You and I may not know. Maybe she spoke about it, but you couldn't do much. So for that, I mean, every human being has the bad side and the good side, but I think the good side outweighed, so I mean, we just take like that.
I'm a Jamaican and it's really bad out there, so they need some repatriation. They cannot pay the slave master and don't give the slave the other people, like in my community, anything at all.
Now, as Queen Elizabeth is laid to rest, all eyes are on her son, King Charles III, to see whether he'll tackle some of these issues head-on. Ian Wafula, Westminster Abbey.
For more on the state funeral of Queen Elizabeth and day's activities, I'm joined live from London by correspondent Henry Ridgwell. Henry, tell us about the day's activities and who will be attending the Queen's private burial.
Well, we've seen the full power, really, of the British state and the pomp and ceremony that it's famous for today. The Queen's coffin was taken from Westminster Hall, that 1,000-year-old building in the parliamentary estate. It was taken on gun carriage to Westminster Abbey for the funeral service, and following behind led by King Charles III and the Queen's other 3 children, followed by Prince Harry and Prince William, and indeed Prince William's 2 children, Prince George and Princess Charlotte, his 2 eldest children. So the succession of the line to the throne on full public display at a time of deep emotional pain for the royal family. The service itself lasted 1 hour. It was attended by over 100 presidents and 20 monarchs from across the world. One British government figure likened it to staging 100 simultaneous state visits. Such was the logistical challenge of getting all of these members of the congregation in place safely for today's service. The coffin was then taken after the service, again by gun carriage, through the streets of London, lined by tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people, many of whom threw flowers at the coffin as it passed by. It was transferred into the state hearse just in West London, and then took the 20-mile journey west to Windsor Castle, of course one of the great royal castles of Britain and one of the Queen's favourite residences, and where many members of the royal family are laid to rest. And in the last hour we have seen the committal service in St George's Chapel in Windsor, and it was there, of course, where the Queen's late husband, Prince Philip, was laid to rest just a year ago. We saw those harrowing pictures of the Queen mourning alone. It was the height of the coronavirus pandemic. Thankfully today there was a full congregation present, mainly members of the royal household, past and present, her staff, whom she got to know very well, of course, over the years in residence at her palaces. There were prime ministers of the realms as well. She is head of state, or she was head of state in 14 other countries apart from Britain, so the prime ministers of those countries, the governors general of overseas territories. And then we had those profound pictures of the Queen's coffin being lowered into the vault below St George's Chapel. This evening, the private burial ceremony will be held, just involving members of the royal family, at about 7:30 p.m. local time in Windsor.
Right, Henry. I think we'll have to leave it there for today. Thank you so much, Henry Ridgwell, reporting live for us from London. This year's gathering of leaders at the United Nations General Assembly in New York is taking place in the shadow of Queen Elizabeth's funeral and the war in Ukraine. VOA UN correspondent Margaret Bishia has more in this preview.
Queen Elizabeth's funeral on September 19th has presented logistical challenges for leaders attending the 77th session of the United Nations General Assembly. Some speeches and meetings may have to be shuffled as they dash from London to New York. This year's meeting takes place at a time of great peril, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres says.
Our world is blighted by war, battered by climate chaos, scared by hate, and shamed by poverty, hunger, and inequality.
Russia's war in Ukraine, which may be at a militarily decisive moment, is certain to dominate the annual meetings. The UN Security Council will meet Thursday at the foreign ministers level to discuss developments. The situation of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant is of particular concern.
We are playing with fire. We cannot continue in a situation when we are one step away from a nuclear accident. The safety of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant is hanging by a thread.
Western officials, meanwhile, want to firm up support from some countries that may be wavering as the war grinds on.
Many African and Asian countries have security relationships with Russia or economic relationships with Russia. And while they were willing to criticize the invasion back in March, they don't want to keep on picking fights with Moscow at the UN.
But with Russian President Vladimir Putin not attending the annual gathering, he rarely does, and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky sending a video address, no breakthrough is expected.
But I have no illusions that at the present moment, the chances of a peace deal are minimal.
Russia and Ukraine are important food producers, and their war has worsened a global food crisis. Supply chain disruptions and rising food prices are exacerbating the situation in the Horn of Africa, which is suffering its worst drought in 40 years. As many as 20 million people are at risk of severe hunger, and famine is looming for nearly 8 million people in Somalia.
The famine is real, and it's happening.
President Joe Biden is expected to lead a high-level meeting on global food security, one of several sessions to tackle the issue. The Secretary General just returned from Pakistan, where deadly floods have submerged one-third of the country. He would like to see climate action high on leaders' agendas.
What is happening in Pakistan demonstrates the sheer inadequacy of the global response to the climate crisis and the betrayal and injustice at the heart of it.
This is the first time that leaders will participate fully in person at the General Assembly since 2020, the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, which has moved from the spotlight as leaders grapple with more pressing issues.
Let's go live now to the United Nations, where VOA UN correspondent Margaret Bishia is standing by. Hello, Margaret. Tell us, tomorrow is the big day when world leaders start addressing the UNGA. What should we expect to hear from African leaders?
Hi, Esther. Yes, a lot of them rushing to catch flights to New York tonight from London from the funeral. So Ukraine may be stealing the headlines, but I think Africa is still very much on the agenda here. Already on Sunday, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres had a meeting with the African Union Commissioner, Moussa Faki Mahamat, and he met separately with South Sudan's Vice President. So I would expect this week we're going to hear a lot about the conflict in Ethiopia, the drought in Somalia, problems in the Sahel. There's no shortage of African issues to discuss here. And I think African leaders in particular will be raising in their speeches during the week the issue of climate change. You know, we're seeing a terrible drought, not just in the Horn, but also in Madagascar. We're seeing rising food prices, fuel prices, a lack of fertilizer. That's something that the Secretary General is particularly concerned about. So there's a lot of issues that they'll be focused on Africa here, but definitely alarm bells on climate change.
You mentioned Ukraine. Will the war in Ukraine likely be a major topic of discussion from world leaders?
I do expect to hear a lot about it from Western leaders. I think they'll use the idea of the UN Charter and respecting its principles as a segue into the topic of Russia's invasion into Ukraine, which is illegal under the UN Charter. It's a violation of it. It's a violation of international law. The Secretary General has been very clear about that as well. And they will raise the issue of Ukraine's grain, which has been stuck in silos, which is now just starting to get out under this deal that the Secretary General brokered along with Turkey's president to get some of the grain out through the Black Sea, and also to ease problems for Russia in getting its fertilizer to international markets. We've seen already in West Africa a shortage of fertilizer. This could lead next year to shortfalls in crops because you need more fertilizer to make more abundant crops. So there's a concern that rising fertilizer prices this year will lead to food shortages next year. So I think we're going to hear a lot about this, and it's directly tied to the war in Ukraine. And there'll also be talk about war crimes in Ukraine. You know, there's going to be a lot of discussion about the war here, but unfortunately, as the Secretary General said in our preview story, little chance of a breakthrough in diplomacy.
Margaret, thank you. That was VOA UN correspondent Margaret Bishia reporting live for us from New York. The President of Botswana says the decision to impose a state of emergency during the peak of COVID-19 helped the country better manage the pandemic. President Mokgweetsi Masisi says the move enabled his administration to implement measures to boost an economy battered by COVID. President Masisi spoke in an exclusive interview with VOA's Peter Clotty on the sidelines of the UNGA.
We committed to mobilizing every resource we had under my leadership as I chaired the presidential task team, which I formed, as a matter of urgency. It was so urgent that in order for us to effectively, to our comfort, manage the situation, particularly the preventative part, which meant taking away certain liberties, civil liberties of persons, we had to put in place a state of emergency. And sadly, it was the longest state of emergency the country had ever experienced, approximately 18 months.
So what would you say has been the positive outcome? Because this is the first time the country has imposed a state of emergency since the country's independence.
No, actually, it's the second time.
Second time, right.
But you know, the nice thing is that we've always imposed our state of emergencies as a result of public need and necessity. So the positive outcome is that we were able, more than we could otherwise have, were able to control the movement of persons, control the size of crowdings that we experienced. We were able to legally manage certain industries from operating, and therefore the behavior of persons, particularly in the alcohol space. We were able to educate our persons and the public about the painful interventions that needed to be put in place, which were necessary for us to manage as best we could the pandemic.
You made mention of innovation. Talking about innovation, how are you carrying out this innovation, and how do you include the youth in terms of expanding your economy, creating jobs for the youth?
Well, you know what we do? We ran hackathons as one. We seek sponsorship for these. The government is building an ecosystem which will enable it, not just through promotion, but in the cognitive delivery of education. We provide opportunity for young people to manipulate gadgets and technology, systems and knowledge that will enable them to churn out and optimize their creativity. We also challenge them. You know, there is a problem, you know, got so many hours or so much time, resolve it, and there's a reward for it. So there's intrinsic motivation built into it. It works to the point where you can afford to fund it. It works to the extent to which you can bring in persons who are brilliant innovators themselves to interact with our young persons. So we promote that through shows and events. For instance, we were this year fortunate to be the first country in Africa to host the Forbes Under 30 Africa Summit. We hope to continue on this collaboration, and in that space we bring some of the best geeks and business persons in the digital space of persons under 30 years old from the world and from Africa and Botswana. And you know, the chemistry of when young people meet and engage and learn from one another is results in unprecedented discoveries at times.
President Masisi also says he wants to deepen the cordial relationship between Gaborone and Washington. His remarks come ahead of the upcoming U.S.-Africa summit scheduled for December. Would like to hear what you think about Africa 54 and all our VOA Africa programs on our website at voaafrica.com. Still to come, a roundup of other Africa stories making news, and VOA's Abdurrahman Yabaro interviews Somali President Hassan Sheikh Mohamud. We'll be right back.
Join me, Heidi Adams, as we bring you Straight Talk Africa from New York to discuss this year's United Nations General Assembly. Leaders from all over the world convene to tackle the critical issues of our time. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has worsened the global food crisis, and it's triggering fears of a potential nuclear accident. Where do African leaders stand, and what are their priorities? We'll have expert analysis for you on the next Straight Talk Africa. Every year, world leaders gather in New York for the annual United Nations General Assembly. Count on VOA to be there, delivering news you can trust on radio, TV, and the web.
Des discours présidentiels aux entretiens en tête-à-tête avec des responsables gouvernementaux de haut niveau. Nous vous tiendrons informés des développements importants touchant le continent.
Líderes africanos vão abordar tópicos como alterações climáticas, o estado da economia, saúde, iniciativas juvenis e muito mais.
Usikose kufuatilia habari na vipindi maalum katika lugha 16 tofauti kuhusu kongamano la viongozi moja kwa moja kutoka makao makuu ya Umoja wa Mataifa mjini New York na Washington DC. Tutakuarifu kila tukio.
A free press is essential. VOA Africa.
In other African news, Eskom South Africa state-owned utility says the nation is again facing sweeping power cuts caused by failures at aging and poorly maintained power facilities. Tunisia expects to reach a deal with the International Monetary Fund in the coming weeks on a loan of between $2 and $4 billion over 3 years. And an advisor to South Africa's Zulu King, Dumisani Blasius Khumalo, was killed by unknown gunmen shortly after attending the Reed dance in Nongoma over the weekend. Somali President Hassan Sheikh Mohamud was in Washington and held talks Thursday with U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin at the Pentagon. VOA Somali Chief Abdulrahman Yabaro later spoke with Sheikh Mohamud.
We have a very good and fruitful discussion about our common objective of fighting and eliminating the menace of terrorism in Somalia, in the Horn of Africa, and globally. We have also revived the defense pact or defense agreement that we had with the United States. The United States being the major partner in Somalia, we have agreed that we further improve the relationship and the working together. And the same, I met the White House staff, the National Security Advisor of the President and his team, and the Homeland Security Chief as well. I also met the Secretary of State in the State Department, and I met the Treasury Department. All of them, we've discussed about the improving the relationship, working relationship between Somalia and those agencies of the United States of America. And all these discussions were really fruitful, and the Somali people will see soon the outcome and the fruits of these discussions.
Thank you, Mr. President. You are the only Somali president historically that was elected twice. And with the experience that you had from the previous years, what's the new things that you're going to use? How are you going to tackle the problems of Al-Shabaab, for example, this time?
Well, Al-Shabaab was there in 2012, 2017, when I was in the office for the first time. And the war against Al-Shabaab in those days and today is a bit different. Al-Shabaab become more complex, and they become very sophisticated, and now we've changed the strategies that we are fighting. We're developing new strategies and new approaches, and we shared all those new strategies and approaches to the United States government, which we really happen to be on the same page for all these issues. So the challenges of this term I'm meeting is quite different. The security, Al-Shabaab is a major one. The droughts and the victims of the climate change and environmental impact is another one.
In a speech to the Washington Somali diaspora community, Mohamud said his government is organizing a strong military front in the southern Jubaland state of Somalia. South African President Cyril Ramaphosa made his first visit to the White House Friday, where he and the U.S. President Joe Biden discussed global security, climate change, trade, food security, and health, and African nations' reluctance to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine. VOA's Anita Powell reports from the White House.
South Africa's president made his first visit to the White House on Friday, more than 4 years after he took office. President Joe Biden said the U.S. values its relationship with the Rainbow Nation.
We have a lot to talk about. There's a lot happening around the world, not only on the continent of Africa, but around the world that you're engaged in as well. So welcome, looking forward to our conversation, and thanks for taking the time to be here.
Biden also fondly recalled meeting Nelson Mandela, the man who led the charge to end the racist apartheid regime. Mandela became the nation's first democratically elected leader in 1994. South African President Cyril Ramaphosa, who is staring down a tight party leadership race as he nears the end of his first term as president, made his priorities clear too.
Really welcome the opportunity to be here so that we can extend those relations and we can get more companies to invest in South Africa to create jobs. We're also here to say thank you for the support that the United States gave to South Africa and to the African continent with regard to fighting COVID-19, the vaccines that you made available.
Administration officials acknowledged that the leaders had sensitive topics to discuss privately. Just hours before the meeting, Ramaphosa publicly criticized pending U.S. legislation that seeks to monitor Russian activities in Africa, saying the bill seems to punish those who hold independent views by not joining the U.S. in condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine. VOA asked the White House if this was the intent of the bill.
The United States isn't making anybody choose between us and somebody else, either whether it comes to Ukraine or in the Indo-Pacific region. We respect sovereignty.
Analysts say the two nations need each other right now.
It's a very critical moment for both countries. They're both terribly divided and narrowly divided, so that I think they can help each other. And that's at the more subtle level than the agenda that is publicly announced, which is very important, not only important for South Africa, but for Africa.
Ramaphosa leads a diverse, resource-rich nation that faces serious challenges, but that has a passion for equality, a knack for beating great odds, and a talent for cheerfully meeting any problem head-on by making a plan. On Friday, the two leaders retreated from their boisterous, outspoken populations to talk about how to make a plan together. Anita Powell, VOA News, the White House.
The Spanish charity Open Arms rescued 372 people seeking to cross the central Mediterranean Sea to Europe in unseaworthy boats in 3 operations over a 24-hour period. Officials say the corpse of one man who had been shot was also recovered. Open Arms remains at sea and is seeking a safe port for the rescued people, including some who need medical attention and many who are suffering dehydration, according to an Open Arms spokeswoman. In the largest rescue, the Open Arms picked up 294 people, mostly Egyptians, from an overcrowded barge in waters south of Malta in a nighttime operation that spanned nearly 5 hours before dawn on Sunday. The people rescued say they had been at sea for 4 days and many were suffering dehydration. The Open Arms also rescued 59 migrants from Sudan, Eritrea, and Syria from an oil platform in Tunisian waters. And that's our show for today. Be sure to watch Africa 54 on our website at voaafrica.com. From all of us here in Washington, thanks for watching.